Earlier this week, the EU agreed on a record-breaking stimulus package to deal with the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic. The $857 billion package included unprecedented steps to help less wealthy countries in Europe. But while this package may have passed, it could also cause more political division between the frugal North and the debt-riddled South. Also, as always, Poland and Hungary were excused for their illiberal tendencies. I'll get into all of this today on the Tonic Accord podcast. Hey, what's up? Hello. How's everyone doing today? Thanks for catching up with me on the Tonic Accord. I'm Alex Kapitko, one of your awesome and lovely co-hosts. First off, I apologize. I recorded this on Friday, but it's coming out on Sunday. But nothing's changed, so this topic is still relevant. Anyways, let's just get after it. I want to start with the background and kind of the facts that led up to this monumentous agreement. I think it's important to begin by discussing that this deal really was unprecedented. It was spearheaded by Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and President Emmanuel Macron of France. And this is a union that I think we've seen growing for a while now, but it's also really interesting to see, and I think it kind of sets a precedent for the world. It's a union of solidarity to not only some of the other countries in the EU, but also to the world, and this is a kind of rare act right now. And for me, I think this deal is notable because it has a lot of firsts. And it's not notable because of what they're trying to accomplish, but how. And I think they've learned a lot from the last Great Recession in the late 2000s. And according to the New York Times, basically the goal of this stimulus is that European countries are going to raise large sums of money by selling bonds collectively, not individually. And a lot of that money will be handed out to the member nations which are hit the hardest by the pandemic as grants. But they're not going to have to repay them. And yeah, there is going to be a lot of handouts, and I think it's going to piss off a lot of Northern European countries. But it's important to note that these national debts that we see in a lot of Southern Europe were because of loans during the last recession that they could not pay off. And yeah, going into that a little bit further, countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy have really never seen a full recovery since this. And now I'm seeing that many economists from around the world, but more specifically in Europe, are predicting a recession that could be far worse than anything since World War II. And I think we'd see countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, and maybe even France suffer more than anyone else. It seems like this stimulus is trying to resolve this. For example, Greece is still recovering, but heavy debt loads have made them reluctant to get any more debt. And their budget isn't sufficient to help self-fund their recoveries. So they're pretty much up, against a rock and a hard place. Like they're just really torn at this point. And that led them to turn to the EU for help. And a key argument in favor of offering grants rather than loans has been that Italy and other countries that are likely to take the aid, they're already indebted. So I know I'm beating a dead horse here at this point, but obviously the EU stimulus following the 2008 crisis didn't work. And it caused a lot of division. So I applaud what they're doing at least trying to find a different way to do this. But the problem here is the second part of this story. Now, I've seen a lot of news sources highlight how groundbreaking this stimulus was, and yeah, definitely, don't get me wrong, it was big. But I think it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just, a happy affair of candies and buttercups. This meeting was officially scheduled to last until Saturday of last week, but it turned into a meeting marked by anger, acrimony, and stalled dialogue, according to diplomats who were present. And it wasn't even until Tuesday morning that a compromise was reached. So this took all weekend into your work week. This is no perfect affair here. And apparently what happened was there was a growing clash between Macron of France and Kurz of Austria. And, I don't want to get into the complicated nature of the difference right now between Austrian politics and French politics, but there is a large line that is marking a staunch difference between the two. And apparently there were visible moments of Macron being angry with Kurz. He was smashing the table, condemning his decisions, and that kind of seemed to be what summed up this entire affair. So to me, what it seems like is that Merkel dove into unprecedented waters. She put her finger on the scale on behalf of Southern Europe. And, I mean, just for a little bit of a background, Germany is historically a very frugal nation in terms of how they work with the EU and their view on these big infrastructure projects. And so they usually side with the so-called frugal four, which was Britain before they left the EU, and then it was also Austria, Sweden, Denmark, and sometimes Finland. And it was interesting during these talks because Merkel actually kind of stepped against them and went across the aisle. And she argued against these countries, and she wanted a more radical and collective stimulus. And it seems like the Frugal Four did find a new ally in Mark Rutte. He is the Dutch prime minister, and he did step into the vacuum left by Germany. And it seems like he opposed almost every proposal, and he definitely allied with Kurz from Austria. And you can kind of see this new sort of frugal group coming out, this kind of new frugal group that is opposed to austerity measures for the most part. And I think the best way to sum up what the northern countries were thinking is when Rutte said that he told his country's media that he didn't care if other leaders mockingly called him Mr. No. And he was called Mr. No during this agreement because he worked on blocking everything. And he's quoted as saying, "We're here because everyone is taking care of their own country, not to go to each other's birthday for the rest of our lives." And honestly, I get that sentiment here. From what I've gathered, wealthier nations like the Netherlands are concerned that the commonly funded aid would simply go into a bottomless pit of spending that just never helps these economies recover. And I mean, one of the elephants in the room in Southern Europe is they're not reducing bureaucracy, and these large pension programs and just the style of government they have doesn't allow them to create jobs and stimulate growth. So I do understand it. And we have seen this to be a common disease in a lot of Southern Europe. So I do hope that this stimulus is not a Band-Aid that's trying to put out a bullet wound. But I do understand that a bloc like the EU is only as successful as their least successful countries. So if you're going to maintain something that brings everyone together, depending on different economies, different regions, different climates, and just different industries, you're going to need some glue to hold everyone together. And I think that's the big divide is Northern Europe, and especially these frugal countries I've talked about, have never really felt like they need to be paying as much as they are. And it's complicated. But so by Tuesday morning, there was a bitter compromise that was reached. But some European diplomats, have voiced concern over the bitterness between these different factions and how it actually may set the scene for future issues in the EU. So the plan that was pushed by Miss Merkel and Mr. Macron was watered down by the end, okay? So the plan that they originally wanted to set out and accomplish did not get through, clearly, when you had Mr. No from the Netherlands. But anyways, the overall figure of 750 billion did remain, but there was an original proposal here to offer 500 billion of that in the form of grants, and that was trimmed down to 390 billion. But they also agreed on the bloc's regular budget for the next 7 years, which is 1.1 trillion euros, and this is to finance the normal EU policies like agriculture, migration, and all those other programs, which I'm not going to get into just for time's sake here. But I can imagine that this entire fiasco is going to leave a very bad taste in the mouth of many Europeans. I go back and forth, honestly, on whether I think this outcome was positive or maybe just a negative that will be dragged out over the next decade. The fact that these countries came together, I guess in the 11th hour, is something that's impressive and worth noting. And it does show that the EU still seems to function as a unified apparatus. I mean, that's definitely not something we're seeing in other parts of the world, kind of with this rise of right-wing populism. But I also worry that regional differences seem to be coming up to the surface again. I fear that if the stimulus doesn't lead to better outcomes in the South, the northern countries are just going to completely leave the table. They're not going to be willing to compromise on this again. And who knows, there could also be a bad taste in southern Europeans' mouths about just kind of this lackluster effort by the North and this lack of caring. And I don't know, it's really complicated, and I just think that I've thought for a long time that I don't know if the EU can survive long term just because of all these differences. And every time there's a crisis, they seem to always come up with they come up with a decision, but it always seems to be more and more difficult. So it's going to be interesting to see. But now, before I'm out of here, I also want to touch on another glaring flaw. It seems like the EU had to appease the illiberal governments of, say, Poland and Hungary in order to maintain and pass the stimulus. So, according to BBC and the New York Times again, in quotes, the deal came at a heavy price in progressive goals. To bring Hungary and Poland on board, EU leaders decided to water down the caveat-making funding conditional on the rule of law benchmarks that the two nations' illiberal governments are violating. In another concession to Poland, the bloc's most coal-dependent nation, a requirement was dropped that would have committed the country to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so basically, Poland and Hungary are allowed to get away with violating democratic norms and kind of the whole EU's message. Poland is not going to need to get off of coal, and they're very coal dependent. And again, the EU is kind of turning a blind eye on, in my opinion, what are not democratic governments coming out of Eastern Europe. So definitely not a positive. And I understand why it's necessary. But like I said, a bloc like the EU is only as strong as its weakest members. And in this case, democracy in the EU is only as strong as its weakest members. So if other states see Hungary and Poland getting away with these slides into almost authoritarianism, I believe others are going to follow. I'm getting sick of these two countries getting passes. And now, this package is not completely finalized yet. It still needs to go to the European Parliament for ratification. And I would definitely imagine that there will be some serious criticism on the grounds of this stimulus not actually kind of pushing back on Poland and Hungary. I mean, they've been enacting illiberal rules on free speech, minority rights, open press, and the rule of law. And so I'm really curious to see if the EU, when it actually needs to ratify this stimulus, if there's pushback. But I think everyone's head is kind of in the sand right now in terms of we need to just get through this pandemic. We need to, we need to at least somehow help our economies in the short term and hopefully the long term. So what worries me is I don't think anyone's really worried about the fact that Poland and Hungary are getting away with this. And so for me, I think that some of these skirmishes we're seeing and the fact that the EU is willing to turn a blind eye on Poland and Hungary shows that maybe this could be the beginning of the end of the EU like we know it. And obviously, that's just my opinion. But yeah, interesting times. And we'll be back tomorrow with another episode of our usual podcast. Thanks for listening. As usual, you can find us on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Please send us a message. Tell your friends. And it's honestly very important that you guys comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps us out. You know, we're seeing the numbers go up, but anything helps. And I just enjoy doing this, so hopefully we can keep doing this as long as possible. Take care. Have a great night.